The mechanics of saddling. Lynn Brown, saddle designer and builder, conducts saddle fit clinics in the United States and abroad. Through his Mechanics of Saddling video series, you'll learn about the physiology of the horse's back and how the muscles and skeletal system are affected by the saddle and the weight of the rider. You'll observe the proper technique for palpating a horse's back for soreness and how to assess the fit of your saddle. Lynn and Lisa Brown gain much of their basic knowledge about saddle fit on a 3,000-mile, 7.5-month horseback trip. This 1982 trip took them through 7 states, including the Rocky Mountains. Because of saddling problems they encountered and solved on the trip, the Browns returned home intent on making a better saddle. Thus evolved the Orthoflex Performance Saddle. They introduced the first patented model in 1986 and are now the largest custom saddle manufacturer in the United States. Since then, they've doubled their growth each year. Here's Lynn at a saddle fitting clinic as he gives the first segment of The Mechanics of Saddling, an introduction to saddling and its history. Lynn shares his discoveries about how horses tell us they're in pain and the common mistakes riders make in understanding their horse's actions.
Quite often we associate all of the behavioral problems that we have with saddling with a horse's personality. And that's something that we do as humans because we put our personality into the horse. We don't always understand the way a horse wants to communicate with us, and we end up giving them our personalities, and the things they do, we put tags on it that are quite human and not really horse-like. My wife, Lisa, who's with me today, does the writing, and she's really what's helped us build this business with newspaper-type folder you see here called For the Sake of Our Horses. In 1982, we started out on horseback, and we had no idea of building a saddle business. We never thought that we would end up in a saddle business, but I did make my saddle for this trip. Before that, I was not a horseman. Lisa was. She introduced me to horses. I really enjoyed them, so I studied a lot about them. This is about 1980, and we prepared for a year and a half for this horseback trip through the West. And as luck would have it, we ended up having a few problems. Initially, we did everything we could to prepare properly for the horseback trip. And one of the things that we did was I built my own saddle for the trip. I've always been a tinkerer and a jet engine mechanic, a hot rodder, an artist, and a craftsman, and so on. So I just couldn't do with a regular saddle. I had to build my own, which was good because I never had any saddle making experience. I started riding with a German Army officer's saddle, and it was a really quite a good saddle. I didn't really know how to use it at the time, but I incorporated ideas that I found from military saddles, ideas I found from very old Western saddles, into a California-styled old slick fork saddle that I built for this horseback trip. And we bought 3 different kinds of pack saddles. We had 3 pack horses and 2 riding horses, and we trained these animals quite extensively before we left. We got our pack rigs and was at a ball putting a pack rig on a registered American saddlebred, these big orange panniers and rocks inside with them bouncing around, you know. So we had, we learned a little bit before we left, and we learned a little bit about packing before we left, as much as we could get our hands on. And we went down and visited one old man by the name of Marshall Hooker, and he lives in Missouri. He's been in law enforcement, and he's been a trick shot for a living all of his life. He's walked or ridden all of the early American trails, the Cimarron Trail, the trails over through the Smokies, the Santa Fe Trail, you name it, Marshall Hooker's done it. He has a couple of books that have been written about him. This man's in the neighborhood of late 70s, and we went to visit him in Webb City, Missouri, to visit with him to find out things we'd need to know about the trip. And as we found since, we were a little cocky. We thought we knew more than we did. And yet we went there to learn. And like so many people that come to us that are going to do a horseback trip come with the same attitude that we went to him with. They came to learn, but they only want to do what they want to hear. And when you tell them what they don't want to hear, they don't really want to listen. So we were the same way. Marshall Hooker kept asking us all these questions, how we prepared for this and how we prepared for that, what we were going to take with us and what we were going to eat, and how many horses we had, if we were going to pack grain or not for the horses, and on down the line. And then finally we came down to a question that he had for us, and he said, well, what are you going to do about saddle soring? And I said, oh, well, we're not going to have any saddle soring. You know, I wasn't listening. So he said, well, he said, you're going to have saddle soring, and I want to know what you're going to do about it. And I said, well, you know, I said, I built my own saddle. I custom ordered this tree with wire diagram to fit the horse. I said, everything seems to work great. And he said, well, he said, I've done that too. And I said, well, we've ridden these horses extensively, and we've got these pack saddles worked out where each one seems to fit each horse, and I just don't foresee a problem. He said, I've done that too. He said, I built my own saddle. And he said, I didn't go very far into any of my trips, but what I didn't have trouble with saddle soring. I said, well, I just don't think we're going to have any. He said, well, he says, tell you what, when you get through this trip, he says, you come back and let me know what you did about saddle soring. And we did, but we remembered what he said. And we hadn't been but about 300 or 400 miles down the road when we were remembering what he said. Because what you do at home and give your horse a rest a day after and a day after that in the way of riding is not the same as when you're in the saddle for 8 to 10 or 12 hours a day for 5 days in a row. And when you've done a few weeks of this 5 days in a row riding with a lot of hours in the saddle, you start seeing problems that you never knew were there when you were just going out and riding for 2 or 3 hours training at home, or riding one long day and then letting your horses off for a while. You've got an unlimited amount of grain, grass, and water. They stay much fatter at home than they do on horseback trips. So this horseback trip became a real good learning experience for us. And I'll give you a little history on the horseback trip and how we got into the saddle business before we get started in the clinic itself. We started north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. We had the 5 horses, and 3 were packed. We rotated these horses somewhat, and we tried to ride through snow that was, we didn't know it was 12 feet deep when you get to the Colorado border in the mountains in mid-April. So we found out that we had to turn around and backtrack and ride through Chama, New Mexico, and we did that, and we were headed over from Chama on to Pagosa Springs, Colorado, into the western slope of the Rockies, so we could ride at that time of the year in the Rockies. And in Chama, New Mexico, we had our first experience with saddle soring. And then it was from there to Cortez, Colorado, before we got something done about it that was really a solution to the problem. We also thought that since we were out west and we were among all the outfitters, cowboys, ranchers, that we could stop and ask an experienced man how to solve this problem, and we get our questions answered. And we got a lot of questions answered, but they didn't always do any good. They weren't always the solution. What happened in Chama, New Mexico is my horse for the last 2 weeks had been acting up so badly that he was going to kill me if I wasn't careful. He was really giving me a problem under this custom-made saddle I had that I had made myself, put these heavy leather panels under to help spread my weight over a larger area on the horse, which is still the same basics as what we do today in a saddle. And after a couple of go-arounds with this horse, one out on a rim of a canyon and another one in traffic where he ran up a shale bank and went up in the air and spun around and back down, and I couldn't control the horse, I was ready to sell him. He was my first horse. He was a runaway the first 6 months I owned him. He was a handful of horse, okay? An athletic horse, a horse that wouldn't succumb or give in to pain. And I called a rancher that was a horse trader, and quite an experienced rancher in New Mexico. I talked to people, and they said, well, he's the man to call. He came out, and where we were camped, and he looked at my horse, and I put the saddle on, and he rode him. And he reined the horse some. He said, well, this horse has been roped off of, and he handles real good. I said, well, thank you. He said, what's your problem with him? I said, well, he acts up. You know, he's just more horse than what I need for a trip like this. And he said, well, he said, the biggest problem with this horse is, he said, he's sore under the saddle. And I'll tell you what, you know, it's bad enough to tell somebody that owns Grandpa's saddle or that owns a saddle that they really like and they bought that it doesn't fit a horse, but it's really tough when you tell a fella who built the saddle that it doesn't fit his horse. And I said, oh, I don't think so. I said, I built this, sounding familiar? I built this saddle for this horse, and I ordered a tree for this horse and everything else. Old boy said, well, he said he's sore under saddle. And I said, well, how can you tell? And he said, well, the way he acts. And he said, here, I'll show you. Take your saddle off. I took the saddle off, and you couldn't see anything on the horse's back. And he took his fingers, and he just poked around lightly on this horse's back. And he said, here, he says, you see this? And I didn't see anything. He said, that's where your horse is sore. I said, well, how can you tell? And this is a good little piece of information for a horse that's quite severely saddle-sored from excessive pressure. And he said, well, look at it. If I poke it with my finger, the imprint stays there. He said, it's squeaky feeling. He said, you poke it over here, that doesn't happen. It bounces back. He had fluid under the skin. He was close to slipping hair. And if he slipped hair, he'd have a raw open wound. And if he had a raw open wound, it could be infected, and you can lose a horse. Fistula was very common in the old days, which is the end result of continued use once you have this kind of problem. And I said, well, what's causing this? You know, what can I do about it? He said, well, first thing I'd do is move my saddle back about 2 inches, maybe 3. And I said, well, what'll that do? He said, well, pinch him so bad up there. Just real simple, basic stuff, you know. And I felt a little silly, and I re-rigged my saddle, and I got it to where it rode back further. And my horse straightened up. And I never had any more trouble through the trip. So I had a saddle that fit the horse, and I only used one light double layer of fleece blanket. I carried 200, my weight, the weight of my saddlebags, my gun, my canteen, everything else on this horse. My poncho or my sheepskin coat was about 275 to 290 pounds when we started this trip. And, hey, that horse never had any more problems. And the stiff panels that I put on there spread the weight out over a large area and worked well. So we learned something there. But we went on down the road, and all the pack animals started having trouble. And now we knew how to look for this pressure soring before the hair fell out. And they were all getting it. And we were just pulling our hair out, and we were switching horses and switching saddles and asking outfitters what to do. Outfitters say, well, I use this kind of double thick pad under a hair felt pad over a double fleece pad, and he says, if you'll just get that set up, it'll take care of your problem. And so I go and I talk to more outfitters, and they tell me about the same thing. So I go buy more pads and more pads, you know, and hey, I still have this saddle soring. So another outfitter tells me, well, you got to cut it out where you have the sore area, and so on and so forth, and that'll eliminate your trouble. And we cut pads out and did all this stuff. Fact of it is, our horses got a viral cold north of Cortez, and we stopped and laid them off for 10 days, and all their backs got healthy, and they weren't sore, you know, they looked good. And we did the best we could on the pads, and I even rasped some of the bars of the saddle trees off so they weren't so severe on the ends. We put these saddles back on the horses. We rode for one long day at the end of that 10-day rest, and voila. Fluid was right back the way it was before we laid them off. Once you get saddle soring, it comes back like that. Once you've sored your animal bad enough, it's very hard to get rid of. You can lay him off for 2 months. You ride him with the same thing that caused that soring, and it may have taken you 6 months to get him to that point, and kabam, it's right back. It doesn't take any time at all once that tissue has been damaged. So we stopped We hitched a ride into Cortez. We bought two. We bought about three heavy sides of saddle skirting, very stiff. We skirted these pack saddles. We rasped them even more. We set them up like my old saddle was that I had made for the trip. We had got rid of some of the blankets that we had. We put these saddles on the horses, and we continued on our trip, and the saddle storing stopped. They healed on the road under a load in a matter of a few days. That's how much of a change it made to spread the weight out over a large area. And this is what we tried to do then in a Western saddle in the marketplace when we finished this horseback trip. We went ahead and rode from there through western Colorado, up through Utah and into the Uinta Mountains, and then from southwestern Wyoming up north as far as Jackson, made a circle through the Wind Rivers, came back down across the Red Desert to Rock Springs, from Rock Springs to Laramie. I rode from Rock Springs to Laramie. Lisa was my conscience on this trip. We had a positive force and a negative force, you know. She's the bleeding heart liberal, and I'm one that's lost my patience, and I'm pissed off at these animals, right? So we both kind of met in the middle by the time we finished 3,000 miles. But I rode, she had to go home for her dad to go in a hospital for a couple of weeks. I rode from Rock Springs to Laramie, which is 245 miles by I-80, and I was off the road quite a bit of the time in the desert. Did that in 5 days, walking pack horses. And so we had some tough horses, and they really moved on out. We learned a lot about saddling, and we rode down through Colorado again, across the plains of Colorado, all the way across Kansas to Missouri at home. We ended up at home November 21st, the day before the worst ice storm we've had in 50 years. And we rode through blizzards. We rode through all kinds of stuff. We had a horse fall down a canyon 300 feet end over end with his pack saddle on. We saved him. 16 days later, we rode out with him. We had a lot of interesting experiences, something that Lisa will probably write a book about one of these days. What we did when we got home was we felt like we had all this knowledge about saddling. But we didn't know we were just still neophytes. And you never stop learning. The more you get into something, it's just like scientists, when you were in school, dinosaurs were cold-blooded animals. You know, you were taught that in school. Dinosaurs were cold-blooded animals. You'd think all those experts that had studied for hundreds of years on dinosaurs and all the scientific knowledge we had, that they'd know whether he was a cold-blooded animal or not. Well, now they're saying they're not cold-blooded. They were not cold-blooded animals. See? So we keep learning, and our base of knowledge keeps growing. And the more we find out that the more we learn, the more we find out we did not know, and we still do not know everything that there is to learn. What we did was to try to market a saddle in a Western pleasure field that was a Western-style saddle like the one I rode on a trip. We spent, between 1983 and 1984, we spent more money on advertising than we did in gross sales of saddles. You simply cannot advertise a saddle and say, this will eliminate your saddle soring. And everybody's saying, I don't have any saddle soring. You know, I don't have any problem. So it was very discouraging to us, and we met a saddle tree maker that had been in business, his family, for 150 years by Nashville, Tennessee. He came up and spent 3 days with us and talked us into making another attempt at the saddle business. He had a very superior saddle tree, and he had a very good bar shape, and he had some theory and some thought behind it, which we had not run into before, and he showed us something, and we learned something from him, and we then, in turn, used something that I had come up with in the meantime to put together a saddle that became what we have today, the Orthoflex saddle. What happened initially to create the little invention of the Orthoflex saddle was that I was sitting in the barn taking a saddle apart I'd sold to an endurance rider, cutting a horn off of it. This endurance rider didn't want this horn on this saddle. And I took the leather skirts off, and the leather skirts, I tried to use thick, heavy leather skirts under these saddles, but they were all softened up now and loose and molded to the shape of the saddle tree. And I knew that that didn't spread the weight out beyond the saddle tree. And I said, damn, there's got to be something better than leather to use between this saddle tree and this horse. And I'm sitting there thinking and thinking, and I said, well, you know, something like a spring would work really well, something that didn't lose its resiliency. So I started looking around to see what I could find, and I grabbed a piece of plexiglass. And I put a piece of plexiglass in a set of heavy leather saddle skirts. And I found, well, there's no way I can mount those back against a tree like you do a normal saddle skirt. So I mounted them with 2 bolts and made them, so to speak, free-floating. They could flex, change angle, bend, you see, because they did not curve like the saddle tree. They stuck out straight. And I took this saddle back to the lady that bought it. She was a top endurance rider in Central Region in 1984. I said, here, I said, I've done something a little different on this. Take it and ride it. And if you don't like it or if it doesn't work, I'll fix it back the way it was. So she had a very saddle-sored horse and was one of the top competitors, which is the way it almost always goes. She went ahead and put the saddle on the horse, finished that season with a sound horse, a back on that horse, and took the Central Region Championships. And we knew we were on to something at this point. We combined this flexible spring panel with a much superior shape of the saddle trees that we have now, and then we modified that shape even more to work with the spring panel. And it gave us a saddle that would change and actually flex to fit a horse and would fit a variety of different shapes. And we patented that. And in 1985, we sold 6 saddles that fall. Lisa came out with this article for the sake of our horses for the endurance riders, and we had saddles in the endurance field in 85 there, and we sold 120 in 86. And it's continued to grow. 240 the next year, 435 the next year, 640 the next year, and 800 saddles last year. And this year, probably over 1,000. So we've grown quite fast in this business, and we've expanded our product line, and we sell enough saddles that we don't have to come out and do a saddle fit clinic to sell you a saddle. I've told you the story, a little of the history about us. What our saddles have done is selling plenty of saddles for us, but we have a lot of customers that come that have our saddles, and I'm looking around the room and I see a number of them, and they came here to learn more about saddling. That's what this clinic is about today. And we won't be talking about our saddles per se, except a short excerpt to differentiate between the way our saddle tree works and a regular tree does and how you position it. What we will do is to share with you some of the knowledge that we've gained from operating in the endurance field. And I know a lot of you that work cattle and so on say, well, endurance riding hasn't got anything to do with the way I work a horse or the way I saddle a horse. The thing that endurance riding does for all of us is just like car racing. You find the weak spots in a product. For us as a saddle company, the endurance racer, and the reason we've supported them and offered guarantees and had an interaction with them for years after selling the saddle was to learn what's happening to this horse under a saddle that may not be working right. So we've learned a tremendous amount from them, and we've developed a product very quickly because of that. And we can pass that knowledge on to you, and I'm going to show you what we've learned about palpating a horse's back today to find if he's sore and why he's sore, what kind of soreness it is, and what it is on the saddle that's not fitting that's causing it, and how to fix that. We're not going to stand here and tell you that you have to buy our saddle to properly saddle a horse. You can properly saddle a horse with almost any kind of saddle. All you have to do is fit it to that horse. Okay? And you'll have to realize today that as we talk about this, there's a distinction. Our saddle you can fit to many different shapes of backs. You can fit a regular saddle. You can go home and fit your saddle. You can take it apart, and we'll show you what it needs to do to fit your horse's back. Now, I'm not saying that you can take that saddle then and put it on a whole bunch of different shapes, because you simply can't do it with a regular saddle. But you can make your saddle fit your horse, and it's not that difficult to do. I will go ahead and mention, too, that in the field of endurance, we have come to the point to where we have almost dominated the major races in the United States. You go to the National Endurance Championships, over half the saddles there are for orthoflex. They come from all over the country. Many last year's championships was won under our saddle, 50 and 100 miler. Many best condition awards under our saddle. The World Championships in '88 was won and best conditioned under our saddle by an American. European Championships last year in Brussels, Belgium, was won and best conditioned under our saddle by a British rider. The Southern German Championships last year was won under our saddle by a German rider. So we're going all over the world with this. We don't even advertise over there. They hear about us. They come over here to buy a saddle. The thing that you will see that about saddling and saddles and horses, just like I used to shoe horses. I had to learn how to shoe them for this horseback trip. And people ask me a lot of times, well, do you know how to shoe a roping horse? Do you know how to shoe a walking horse? You know, do you know how to shoe a draft horse? I say, yeah. Well, how do you do it? I say, there's only one way to shoe a horse, and that's the right way. Okay? All horses' feet and basic conformation are the same. There is a balanced way to shoe a horse with proper weight distribution in the foot and the leg, and there is the way that somebody's going to do it to make their horse slide differently, to gait differently, and all the things that we do to get something that we want to see in a horse, but which is not good for him. So there's only one right way to saddle a horse. There's only one place to put a saddle on a horse that's correct for the horse, and that's what we'll go into today, because we see a lot of saddle makers that do not know how to fit a saddle tree to a horse. We see a lot of saddle makers that never look at a horse when they build a saddle. But they're starting to be saddle makers that are trying to fit the horse, and they do use our information. They have used it to build trees that are now fitting horses differently. We're not the only ones in the world that have done this. This has been done before. I'll stand here and tell you right now that almost nothing we have done with a saddle, except for the spring skirting system, has not been done before. There's been more things done with saddles and stirrups and pads and you name it than Carter's Little Pills. I thought I had a real neat little invention, an idea for a spring stirrup to absorb shock. Went to Washington when I was getting the patent done on our saddle. We had no problem with our patent on our saddle because there was nothing similar to it that had ever been done. I went in to look up stirrups. There were 350 patents on stirrups. Over 50 of those were on spring stirrups starting in 1832. Okay, so it's hard to find anything that hasn't been done or tried before. And some of these things work, and some of them were not marketed properly, and the spring stirrups were first brought out in the western field. Say, right here in the good old U.S. And I had another idea. I thought, boy, these endurance riders riding at night need a little light on their stirrups. Wouldn't that be neat? In 1796, there was a stirrup patented with a lantern in the front of it and a foot warmer to boot. You know, I mean, they were way ahead of me. So you have to realize that we think we're a very technologically smug society. We think because we have cars and television and satellites and electricity and all of the conveniences that we have, all the technology that we have, that we know so much more than the people that came before us. We look upon them as very backward, essentially, and not nearly as developed or as brilliant as we are. But it's just not the case. What we have done with saddling is actually to move backwards, you know, since the horse was really used. And I would say that adopting the saddle in the first place was probably a move backwards. And if we want to say when the zenith of saddling developed, I'd say it developed in two places. One was in England and Europe, and the other was in California. And there's two different styles of saddling, but a vaquero that had a sore-backed horse was looked upon as just the lowest form of animal life that you could find. And it wasn't that way throughout the West, I'll guarantee you. We'll go ahead and talk a little about history now. History of horse and man is very interesting because we don't know when man started riding a horse. It was so far back that it's on cave drawings. So man's association with a horse could run back as far as 20 or 25,000 years. We don't know, but well beyond recorded history. We do know that Asia was conquered by different barbarian tribes. Really, power shifted from one side of the continent to the other. One of the most famous groups of horsemen to first appear were the Scythians. They rode out of the Russian steppes and they were the most feared warriors of their day, and they lasted for hundreds of years. There were many others, the Parthians, the Sarmatians, and all of these names you may not recognize, but many of the things they did we still use in our language, and many of the things that they developed we still wear on our feet and our legs, pants and boots. And they were absolutely some of the toughest people you could ever imagine. They grew up on a horse. They were nursed on mare's milk. They ate horse meat. They enjoyed it. They used the horse. They worshipped the horse, and they simply lived on horseback. A man in their society that did anything that was not on horseback was considered really of the lowest level. And they conquered people, and they took. This is essentially how they lived. It is interesting that they developed a lot of things. They even had things such as bits for horses and so on. But they never developed saddles. Pack animals have been used since time immemorial, and pack saddles of some kind have been in existence. But man never used a saddle on a horse. And we go into later periods of time. The early Greeks, the early Romans, I would say the Greeks period, and the early Romans and so on, the Egyptians, never used a saddle. And yet we have cultures that are quite advanced with running water and sewage systems and things such as the Circus Maximus in Rome, where we have seating for 300,000 people to watch horse racing. We have horse races going from daylight till dark 7 days a week. We have on-track betting. We have off-track betting with passenger pigeons, carrier pigeons, I mean. So we have a society that is really quite advanced and intelligent and recorded history, and saddles were known to exist, but they never used them for warfare, and historians have a hard time putting this together. Why they never adopted the saddle? It was seen in Hungary here. They conquered this group, and they never spread it. The Mongols, the Mongolians, the Huns, they never took the saddle with them back across the continent. They never even adopted it. And Lisa and I feel that the reason being is that these people knew that you can't take a little rigid object. I mean, folks, we're looking here at just a saddle tree as a rigid object, and put it on a horse's back that's constantly changing shape and moving without having some problems. Add to that they would ride 1,000 miles in 3 or 4 days with 3 horses per man. We now then have to put a saddle from horse to horse to horse as we're traveling, and they travel 24 hours a day, stopping every hour for a few minutes of grazing, and then riding hard and switching horses. And they could surprise an enemy 1,000 miles away with a force of 20,000 warriors. Stop and rest up the night before a battle, and just clean house and catch a whole society unsuspecting. So they had to have a horse in this kind of battle. You have to realize we fought with swords, lances, and bow and arrows on horses. It's darn hard to fight with all that stuff if you got to hold reins in one hand. You've got to have a horse that you can ride from your seat and from your legs. And these horses have to be highly trained for battle. And the same with the Indians. Okay? They never rode saddles. They rode bareback pads. And same with these people. A lot of them didn't even ride bareback pads until later in history. But still, they were in contact with the horse. They felt the horse moving. The horse felt them. The horse obeyed them. And that's what they had to depend upon in battle. And if you put a saddle on a horse and you ride that horse 1,000 miles in a few days with 2 other horses, and you then expect that horse to not be sore, and you be able to go into battle and have him obey the seat aids, then you're not living in the real world, because they couldn't do that. And so the saddle was actually not adopted universally for warfare until 1200 AD. And then throughout Europe and Asia, the saddle by that time was pretty well adopted universally. But to give you an idea of what happened, we have groups like the Romans, who were the first light cavalry in the world to adopt the saddle. And I always maintain that the saddle was developed not to fit a horse, but to make a man's posterior more comfortable. Okay? It wasn't made to fit a horse because a horse is moving and changing shape, and you have all kinds of problems trying to now fit this rigid object to this horse. The Romans adopted the saddle at the height of the decline of the Roman Empire in 385 AD. The next year later, there's a law on the books, a Roman law on the books, that any saddle found weighing over 60 pounds on a horse would be broken in two on the road, and if it was found the second time, you would be fined severely and your horse taken away from you. See, we had a situation where in 1 year already saddles were becoming so posh and comfortable that they had a problem with them on horses and being used to excess for comfort of man on horse. In about 80 years later, around 460 or 70 AD, the Huns swept down out of the north on unsaddled, unbridled horses. The Romans were on saddled, bridled horses. They were using spurs to control their mounts, and bits and reins to control their mounts, and they were soundly defeated by the Huns. It's no wonder the U.S. Army never caught an Indian in their life. You know? And they will absolutely praise the Indians' horsemanship. And on payday outside the fort, here comes an Indian with a scraggly little old pony, and here's a Army officer with a big gorgeous thoroughbred cross. And they have payday races, and who usually won? The Indian bareback on a scraggly little pony. And they couldn't even catch a whole tribe of them going all through the north. What was it, St. Joseph's ride? Joseph of the Nez Perce? They couldn't catch a whole tribe of old men and women and children on horseback. And the Army's history, not only in our country but in Europe, is one of woe when it comes to saddle fit, and the horses lost on the trail in any extended campaign due to saddling in a large part. Do you ever wonder how you could have a horse and he's just the nicest guy in the world on the ground? When you go to get on him, he becomes a real pain. Now, my first horse was a runaway. He was spirited. He didn't want anything to do with me on top of him. If I take him out for a ride, you think he'd stand still for me if I just wanted to stop someplace? Nope, had to be moving. He would dance, he would rear, he would do anything if we weren't moving. Oh, boy, this horse has got a psychological problem. He has really got a problem. No wonder this horse trader sold him to me. And that same horse I had for years. It took me 6 months to learn to keep him from running away with me. But every time I got off that horse, you know, he was the nicest horse in the world. He would come up and just be so gentle on the ground. You could do anything with him. You could shoe him any way you wanted. You could sleep underneath this horse. He wouldn't step on you, ever. And I thought, how could this horse be, you know, I'm mad at him. He's acting like a pill. We're having a fight, okay? We fought now for 2 hours on a ride, and I get off of him, and he loves me to death. I couldn't understand how that horse could have good feelings toward me when I was still pissed off at him, you know? And I just essentially after a while learned that that horse was so glad to have me off his back, you know, that he was tickled to death for me to get off. He thought that was the nicest thing I could have done for him that day. And think about it. And we get into horses then that are kids' horses, or that are women's horses. Well, most women don't weigh as much as men. Well, you know, my wife can go out there and catch that horse. He weighs 105 pounds like mine does. That horse will just do anything for her. He'll come up to her in the pasture. We have no problem whatsoever. And she rides that horse, and he just does everything she wants to do. But some man must have beat him at one time or the other, because I can't catch him in the pasture. I can't put a saddle on him. If I go to step on, he spins around. Once I do get on, he bucks. And then we go for a ride, and that horse is the nastiest thing you've ever seen. And I weigh 220. Just a wee bit of difference. And yet, you have another horse. And he's really works for you. He does everything well. but he's got a bad habit. He's got a personality problem. He's been overstressed. He's been overtrained. He tosses his head. He just won't keep his head down and work, and look where he's going. So we put tie downs on. We put martingales on. We make them get their head down and work. And I think you'll find it very interesting what you see in the way of heads up and what causes it. Because I took a 15-year-old horse at the time I developed the spring skirting system. I put a saddle on him, and he had always been a head tosser and carried it too high. And he dropped his head, and he's never had it up since. See? So it's a saddling problem. It's mechanical problems with the saddle and the horse. You ever have a horse that you were training, and all of a sudden he wouldn't give to the bit on one side, and he wouldn't turn?
I've got a man on that.
Yeah. We'll show you why that happens with saddle trees today. You have a horse that refuses to take a proper lead, or is constantly switching leads, or doesn't want to stay in one gait. It's often a saddling problem. We have competitive riders that have horses that tie up and any number of things like this, and they can often be saddling problems. So we'll go into a lot of this, and we try to give our horse our personality. Well, we just overstressed him, you know. You can only train him for an hour. You warm him up for 20 minutes, you train him for 10 minutes, and you cool him out for 30 minutes. That's what a good trainer will tell you, okay? Otherwise, we're going to overstress his mind, when really what we're dealing with is teaching him to work under pain in the back. Did you ever wonder how come it takes 6 to 10 years to train a top-level dressage horse? To do all these dressage movements, which are all natural movements to the horse without a rider? Essentially, that's what we're doing, you know? And very few of them make it, because very few of them have the right combination of rider and saddle and training and temperament to make it. What you have initially, obviously, that the saddle is resting on is a layer of skin. Under that is a sheet layer of ligament, and the muscles underneath that, the main muscle that we have to deal with here is the longissimus dorsi. The longissimus dorsi is the muscle I alluded to earlier, vulgar, which is really the largest muscle in the horse's body, and it attaches back here to the sacrum and then to the spinal processes, which are fins that come up off the vertebrae in your horse's back. These fins are highest in the front, right here above the wither area, and right here above the sacrum in the rear. And this longissimus dorsi has a loin muscle that attaches into it right through here on the horse. The loin muscle is actually inserted. Kind of looks like an arrowhead or a spoon as it is inserted into the longissimus dorsi. So what we have then is attachment on either side of the loin muscle and to the spinal processes through the upper part of the backbone all the way down through the back, and it attaches into the spinal processes at the base of the withers, okay, from right in here and goes downward. It runs underneath the shoulder blade on your horse and attaches into the base of the neck. Up in here, it actually fans out in front and attaches to the base of the neck. So this longissimus dorsi runs from here to darn near here on the horse. And I always thought, before I dissected a horse, that obviously since we had ribs right here, that we had just a thin layer of muscle right under the saddle on the horse's back. But what happens is that the ribs actually end where you stop feeling them, right in here, and they shoot straight inward, and they actually will arch down a little bit. So you actually have about a 4-inch section of muscle that is filling in that area here between the spinal processes. The actual spine of the horse, the backbone itself, the spinal column, is way down low in this horse. and these spinal processes come up off of it. And we'll explain what they do in a little bit. So what we have is really a backbone that runs through this horse, and it runs much lower than what you would think, and it comes down very low through here, and then the neck curves upward. And these spinal processes are quite high through this area. And we have the longissimus dorsi running full length. Now, a lot of times we think of a muscle as being one large unit and having a belly that contracts and attachment points. But here we have a muscle that's segmental. And by segmental, I mean that it has a band of muscle that starts here and runs forward, and they attach onto the upper surface of the ribs. So we have muscles now, this one big muscle being made up of segments that runs down and forward, all the way through this horse and spreads out and attaches in the manner I'm showing you there. What this does is to fire segmentally. This muscle doesn't contract all at once. It contracts from the back to the front. Okay? One segment at a time, and it does it in lightning speed. And if your horse is in real good shape and sweated up and you pony it at a strong trot, that's when these muscles start to come into play and are really used hard, is at a strong trot or above, at a canter or a gallop. The other muscles that we have to deal with that are tied into this are the gluteal muscles, which we call the forward portion, a loin muscle is a common term, and then the quote, rearing muscles down the back of the horse's leg. Right up here we have the shoulder blade. And this shoulder blade runs from the point of the shoulder right here. It runs right up through this horse's shoulder, and it takes up an area like this. You see how large a shoulder blade we have on this horse. As I check this horse, we have a shoulder blade that runs clear back into here. Okay? And there's a large area like this, probably even a little larger to there. Back down through to here. We have a fin in the middle of it, which is a hard bone with muscles running each direction that lie on top of the shoulder blade. The one thing that we have to do when we're saddling is we always have to position the saddle to the shoulder blade. Reason being is that you don't want to interfere with the way this animal moves. And this shoulder blade moves. It has no socket, like a hip joint or something like that. There's no socket that this operates on. This whole shoulder blade is attached to the trunk of the horse, okay, by nothing but muscle and tissue. It is a loose attachment. The horse can actually pull his body up by contracting one of these muscles. He can actually lift his body somewhat. See? He can lift his trunk, or he can let it down by relaxing or contracting the serratus ventralis muscle that runs through here and all the way forward and into here and attaches to the underside of the shoulder blade. And it actually is what attaches. It also attaches to the top side of the shoulder blade. It splits up, but it's a fan of muscles that run through here. When I poke a horse right here and he jumps, then I'm hitting the serratus ventralis muscle, and it attaches the trunk of the horse to the front end, to the shoulders that hold this horse up. So this shoulder blade, if we'll imagine it, it pivots at a point about right here. 2/3 of its length up from the bottom is its pivot point. And you see it moving freely here in the shoulder of this horse. If we find the back of this shoulder blade, which is right here, and we have an enlargement right there, it's not natural. We find the back of it and pick the leg up like the horse was moving, all of a sudden it moves back to here. So we have a 3 to 4 inch rotation of this shoulder blade at the top whenever we have movement of the horse. The muscles that you see right through here, like this muscle is called the trapezius. And this is the aft section of the trapezius. And this is the cervical section. This is the ventral section of the trapezius. We have a muscle that pulls, it attaches to the outside of the shoulder blade that pulls it up and forward, or we have it pulling it up and back. It actually lifts the shoulder blade up some and pulls it up and forward or up and back. We have muscles underneath that called the rhomboids. And they do the same, but they attach underneath the shoulder blade. So right through here, we have a lot going on with the horse. There are other muscles also that operate and help provide leverage for the horse when he's running. When his head goes down, it actually helps him become more mechanically efficient, and they run through the top line and they split right here. But what we see abused the most is the trapezius muscle, right here, in the base of the longissimus dorsi, where it attaches into this wither area and runs around the trapezius and the rhomboids. And what we see in most saddling situations are saddles that are fitted up to the shoulder blade, and I'll show you what I mean here. This horse, if you notice that this horse doesn't want to stand still, and I picked a horse that's a little jumpy for this demonstration, it's for a reason, because this horse has reasons to be jumping. You see this little bit of a bump we have here on this shoulder? It's not natural to that horse. That's an enlargement on this shoulder. Just a bump right there. Most horses, if you look at them, they have a pretty smooth contour if they haven't been ridden a lot. If they've been ridden, particularly with a Western saddle, you'll see a lot of hard little lumps or enlargements on the shoulders of horses. And usually that's because we will end up with a saddle being placed right here. A lot of our riggings that you see nowadays are 5/8 or 3/4 rig, and it means that it is going to be, it means that the saddle is going to be pulled forward some by the girth, because you have to girth in the heart girth area of the horse. And this saddle, the way most saddles are rigged on this horse, we've got a heart girth area right here. Even if it's a full forward rig, the chance of your saddle being clear up here are very good. And you have to have an unusually constructed Western saddle to use it up here. And I'll explain one of the difficulties later on when we get into trees on this subject. But you can see that what happens in this position is that rotation of the shoulder blade runs into the saddle. Put weight on it and get an idea of what happens when that horse extends. So really what we should do in this instance, if we wanted to free this horse's front end up, is put that saddle back here. This is where the saddle should rest. We should have about 3 inches, possibly 4 inches from the back of the shoulder blade to the front of the saddle. And that's where a saddle should go on a horse, and I'm speaking of any saddle, and we're even speaking of a forward seat hunt saddle. What happens if we have rotation and we have a saddle here is your horse pulls up. He no longer freely extends his front end. And the thing that does to the horse also is to put a lot of weight on the front end of the horse. So this muscle that runs through this back that you see right here cannot be pinched or dug into. I'll explain to you why, and it's essentially because this muscle does not contract on both sides at the same time when a horse moves. It only contracts on one side as that hind foot is pushing off. The horse really gains a lot of his power for movement from the hindquarters. So to speak, this is the engine, the power plant of the horse. The front end of this horse has not got the attachments nor the musculature to really pull this horse forward strongly. Okay? So it depends upon the back end for a propelling motion, for propelling power. And what we have to start that, obviously, starts at the foot and moves on up the hind leg. And we have here muscles that straighten the hock, pull back the thigh, and the rearing muscles in the horse. And they're very powerful. And they're the muscles that allow a horse to actually stand up and hold its front end up in the air. They go on forward and include the gluteal muscles. If you stop and think about it, this very large loin muscle right here does nothing but regulate the amount of weight on the front end of the horse. And the same with the longissimus dorsi as it goes forward. We have from the rear not only an action that is pushing the horse forward, but that is lifting it up. And to do that, this muscle has to fire segmentally as we go forward, like we explained earlier. We start with this lifting action from the hind end, and I'll explain to you how that action works. If you can imagine yourself holding a fishing pole, and it's a deep saltwater rig, and you have the butt of it stuck against your stomach, and you're holding it up above the reel. Well, in this instance, you're playing the same part as these gluteal muscles do, where they break over the sacrum of the horse here, because this is a pivot point for these muscles. And the kind of leverage you get is just like lifting a fish on the end of a fishing pole with your hand. You're playing the part of the muscle. If we have a long pole, like we have a long back in this instance, then your leverage is reduced. You cannot lift a 250-pound tuna out of the water with a 10-foot rod. You have to get a 5-foot tuna pole, say a tuna rod. Then you gain leverage. If your pole gets below level, you lose leverage. Obviously, the higher you go, the more leverage you get. That's why a horse can stand on his hindquarters. He gets that leverage up where he can really handle it. We'll assume here that the fish is the weight of the forehand of the horse, the head, the neck, the shoulders, and so on. And that's what we are lifting here at the rear. Okay? So that's a fixed weight this fish is in this instance for this horse. If we enter a rider into this picture, think about it. The rider is a weight that we tape up onto the fishing pole. The further we put the rider out and forward, then the more we work the loin muscles on the horse. So when people say, well, you're too far back on your horse, you're going to work those loin muscles. You're going to sore them up. You make their job easier when you get back on the horse. Just simple leverage dictates that. We start the lifting action at the hindquarters, and this one leg pushes off at a strong trot, for instance. That loin muscle lifts, and this muscle contracts. You have to realize that when that muscle contracts, all it does is extend the vertebral column. It extends it from the top. It just lifts those vertebrae from the top side and off at an angle, so it actually pulls that vertebral column up and out. You see what's happening there? Just pulling up and out, because we attach here and here. And as this muscle fires, it doesn't just lift the front of the horse now. The longissimus dorsi does not. The loin muscle more or less lifts the whole front of the horse as much as possible. The mechanical action is then continued through this longissimus dorsi. But it lifts up and out. And the reason that it extends the vertebral column is so that when the horse pushes off with these hindquarters, we do not shove those vertebrae together, one against another. Can you imagine what would happen to the joint surfaces if we didn't have this muscle here to extend that vertebral column? But at the same time, we notice that when a horse moves, his back doesn't hollow. I mean, when this horse is just contracting this muscle alone, he simply hollows his back because his back has gotten longer. It's been pulled from the top side. The vertebrae have been expanded, and they have to go somewhere. So they're going down in this instance, okay? And they'll go down considerably. What we have to do is to collect the horse somewhat. And all that's needed is a natural degree of collection. But in collecting the horse, what we're talking about is getting the head and neck down in a natural position and having the hindquarters down and working in a natural position. You ever see a horse, ever see somebody get on a horse, and as soon as they get on, these hindquarters just do like that, and they operate that way? That horse can't carry weight on his back. The rest of the system that has to work in the horse is the system for straightening the horse's back and keeping it straight. And that system is comprised of muscles and ligaments that hold these spinal processes that we talked about together in the back. The way these spinal processes come up, you have one coming up straight and then the other shoot off this direction to provide mechanical leverage, just like you'd see on a suspension bridge. Okay? And we have another high spot here, and the actual spinal cord is quite below this. We have another high spot here, not quite as high as the front. But we also then have the little spinal processes angling this direction until they get to the middle. And we have ligaments, and we have muscles that hold these spinal processes rigid and actually provide a support like you'd see in a suspension bridge with a pylon or structural point here and cords coming off of it to the middle and another one right here and support coming down off of each side of it. Now on our suspension bridge, if we took our mounting points for at each end of the bridge that held up these structural pylons, if we took the mounting point here, the cable here, and just loosened it, what happens to the bridge? Okay? It sags in the middle. No longer holds weight. So when we take a horse and we pop its head up in the air, see here? We have a head that goes up. We have a croup that's flattened. We no longer carry weight efficiently in the middle of this animal's back. And I'm not hurting this horse particularly when I do this. Slight bit of pressure, maybe 5 pounds. But when this horse is like this, it can't carry weight. It no longer has weight-carrying capacity in the middle of this back. It's called dorsiflexion when I pinch here and have the back drop. Right? And you'll notice that if I had a saddle tree that fit this horse, but that pinched right here, all of a sudden we would lose our fit. The surface that was contacting here might now not contact. So we have to have this weight-carrying capability of the horse being used for this horse to move forward efficiently and for him to be able to carry the weight of the rider. He has no problem when you're not on him. If you don't goof something up with a saddle or the way you ride, he has no problem. So in collecting the horse, it's simply, you don't have to have a tremendous amount of collection as in dressage. As Caprile said, who is the father of the hunt seat, the forward seat, jumping saddle, the horse only needs a natural degree of collection to easily carry the weight of a full-size man. That means he has to go with his head down, just like it is here, a little lower, okay? We want this head down like this while you're moving on that horse. We don't want him to be a peanut roller. You know, we don't want that. That's too far. But we also want the hindquarters under the horse and working. And if you have this action when you get in the saddle, forget it. You know something's going wrong already. Because he cannot carry the weight here. What now distributes power, if you'll think about this, what distributes power from the rear to the front is not just this muscle working and extending the vertebral column, okay? It is this muscle working in conjunction with the weight-carrying, back-straightening capabilities of this suspension bridge throughout the horse's back, also working. That comes from as far down as the abdominal muscle. You see this back when you touch the abdominal? straightens it immediately. There's more flexibility here than what a lot of experts will acknowledge in the back. And as the horse is ridden and ridden and ridden, and we'll get into this on saddle soring problems that we run into, this back becomes more rigid. And we lose our flexibility. So it really depends on what horse you look at as to how flexible he is in the back. So what's happening here is this horse is moving again. We push off with a hindquarter. The loin muscles, the rearing muscles on that side, the hamstring muscles as they're called, help to lift the front of the horse so he can put that foot out and take off. He cannot operate fluidly or with any suspension in the front end without help from back here. Okay? Well, that lifting action goes to about here, where the loin muscles, they also extend the lumbar area of the vertebra. They extend the lumbar section of the vertebra, and the longissimus dorsi carries it on forward, clear down into the base of the neck, extending the vertebra. Okay? And the firing of the muscle goes like this. You ever wonder how a little caterpillar could lift himself all the way up from the hind end? You ever see a snake lift himself up about half of his length into the air? Okay? This is the same muscle action. It's the serrated muscle action, and it's sequential. And it's happening from back to front. And if you ever see it on a horse, it's so fast, it looks like somebody's running their fingers down a piano real quick. Okay? It is the strongest muscle in the horse's body. And that not only lifts the horse up, but pulls him sideways. And if you don't pull him sideways, you're liable to have something we call interfering. You ever have a horse clip and interfere himself? You ever see a horse that'll do that with one rider, not with another? You ever see a horse that you have that problem with and a previous owner didn't? Think about it. We're pushing off with the left hind, and if we just push off with the left hind, where does the horse go? This way, and then this way, and then this way. So we have to stabilize the lateral motion of this horse. So not only do we lift with this longissimus dorsi, but we also stabilize this lateral motion by pulling this horse, by pulling him to the left when he pushes off with the left, because we are lifting and pulling outward by the way this muscle is attached down through the back. And that's what keeps your horse moving forward and in a straight line. So all of a sudden your saddle is sitting on some important mechanical components in the horse. Extremely important. Did you ever take a young horse out? He's trotting in the lot. He looks like his front feet are never going to hit the ground. He just throws them out there and they're suspended in the air like a fine dressage horse. And you say, boy, I can't wait until I get on to him. Is he going to be a peach? And the more you ride the horse, the less he extends. The more he pulls up, choppier his gait gets. Right? You're interfering with the actions of the muscles in this back to have that happen. What happens when this muscle gets pinched by a saddle? Well, we know that if we pinch right here at the base of the longissimus dorsi, right here at the wither area and the trapezius, that they simply lock down and the head comes up and the croup flattens if you're not careful. And when that happens, this horse no longer moves forward in a fluid manner. The muscles have to work with one being flaccid, completely relaxed, while the other one fires sequentially forward on this longissimus dorsi. Now, at a canter or a gallop, they're so close together that they're just tiny split second apart. But they are still that tiny split second apart. But at a big trot, it's where you really see it. If it's not working, horse trots like a cow. He's rough. Cows trot with the longissimus dorsi firing on both sides at once. So do many horses when they have a rider on. If these muscles are contracted we no longer have, if they're already partially contracted because they are sore, we no longer have this natural lifting segmental firing that we should have to stabilize the horse laterally or to lift him on the forehand and to regulate the weight on the forehand of the horse. So it becomes very important that we have a saddle that fits, okay? That doesn't pinch and that doesn't bridge the back and apply pressure here, apply pressure here. See our head again? We talked about tie downs a while ago. You imagine what 200 pounds does at a trot? It doubles your weight. You then weigh 400 when you come down, okay? If you weigh 200 just sitting still. And that's why you need a tie down if something's not working right. And there's more than one cause for that in a saddle. It may not just be fit. It may be where you're positioning it. Think about what happens when your saddle's positioned too far forward. You know, we have the narrow part of a saddle. The narrow part of a saddle tree is right here. So we're widest at this point, and as we go back, we narrow. You can see it. This is a typical common endurance tree. It's not one of ours. But what happens when we put saddle too far forward is it simply pinches right here because we've got the narrow part of the saddle trying to fit down over this arched shape of the horse's back. If it can't do that, if it can't get down here to carry some weight, it pinches right there. And the horse then dorsiflexes. And if your horse dorsiflexes, he contracts this longissimus dorsi and possibly the trapezius right here, but definitely contracts his back and holds it in at least partial contraction, depending on how bad the horse is. I've seen horses locked up so bad that that back was hollowed all the way down. You ever see a sway-backed horse? Want to know why a horse gets sway-backed when he's ridden? He gets sway-backed when he's ridden because he's been ridden like this all of his life, and he was predisposed to that in the first place, more than likely. But they feel that more of it comes from riding and saddling than any other thing. Some horses will be sway-backed from birth if they're never ridden, but very few. Most of them operate with some degree of dorsiflexion. And then that causes the back to arch, and that causes the saddle to fit even less. And pretty soon, we have a situation to where what we might have started out with a fit on, see, right now we have about 1/4 of an inch of air underneath the bar of this tree on this straight-backed horse. What we might have started out with a fit on, we lose altogether, see, with the dorsiflexion. So just the pinching right here is your biggest enemy in saddling. It's the hardest thing to get around. Now let's add to this a back that runs downhill some. We scoot our saddle back. And what happens? Slides forward to where it comes up against that shoulder blade and it, quote, rests in that place that it just naturally wants to sit. So we don't let the saddle rest where it wants to be. We take into account movement of the shoulder blade, and then we position the saddle where we want it, and then we have to figure out a rigging that will keep it there. But let's get into that later when we talk about saddle trees and positioning, and let's go ahead and talk about what happens to this horse's back if he continues to operate with dorsiflexion. Mechanically, what happens to him? These spinal processes that we talked about earlier, they are made to operate in a rather straight back, okay? And they're made to have the head and the croup down, you know, and to not be, here, we'll get a croup down right here, see? And for the weight-carrying capability to hold up the middle of this horse in anything he does, or she, like carrying foals. So we want the rear end tucked under to carry that weight. And now our spinal processes have a decent amount of space between them, okay? I mean, we're looking at fins sticking up off this backbone, off the spine. And if they're like this when the horse is straight, or let's say they're tilted this way, when the horse is straight, what happens? When the horse dorsiflexes his back, he extends the vertebral column. He does it by pulling from the top. And you pull those babies together and extend these vertebrae. And you pull them together at the top and you ride your horse that way. And you have problems with the spinal processes running into each other, overlapping. Extreme soreness and fluid develops around them. Okay? You even have calcification in false joints that develop in a condition that's called spondylosis deformans. And that's simply a very fancy term for an extremely sore back. And it means that you have actual damage in the spinal processes and in the surfaces of the vertebrae themselves. And you have a fusing, in most cases, of the vertebra when this has happened over a long period of time. So you may take a horse that's very sore back, he develops a certain amount of sway to his back, this dorsiflexion, he operates with it for a long time, and his sore back goes away. Now we've got one tough old horse, but he's just not as athletic as he used to be because he has actually fused, bring this way, he has actually fused in the thoracic vertebra from number 8 to number 14. The vertebra of the thoracic region often fuse in here, and the spondylitis that was in there, the inflammation and the lesions, then fuse the joints together. We have actual solidifying of the vertebra and false joints made in the area of the spinal processes. That stops all movement here and stops the pain. And that's called ankylosis of the vertebra. We're now fused. We've got an older and a very rigid horse through here. And your horse may fuse with a back that's relatively straight. He may fuse with a back that's very hollow. And his head will remain in an up, his neck in an up position. There's nothing you can do about it. He doesn't show much in the way of soreness at that time because this spondylitis is self-limiting. At one point or another, the body is going to do what it has to do to protect the animal from the pain. I would say that if you have extreme soreness right through here, okay, this is a very light action that I'm doing, then you have a condition that could be taking place in this horse right now where the spinal processes have overlapped on each other a little bit. I don't feel like that's very serious on this horse because we don't see as much reaction to it as I do in a horse that's really in bad way. Something like an endurance horse. It's really been ridden a lot. Just the lightest touch right here will drop one of those horses a foot. The lightest touch. So that's where the spinal processes really have damage that's taken place in there right then. That horse cannot be used without a tremendous amount of pain to the horse unless he is under a good degree of collection. I took a horse at Cave Creek, Arizona when I did a clinic there about a month ago. It was an Arabian, had been endurance ridden. And too much weight carried up front, pinching taking place here, operating with dorsal flexion. It was a really well-trained Arabian and a nice horse. You touch him here, you could take him clear to the ground if you wanted to. And the same with this here. And this was much more tender than what this horse is. This horse is a basket case. When he came in, the gal rode him for me. Typical very long endurance stirrups. Standing on her toes to trot and hitting the seat of the saddle and the saddle running downhill and all of her weight going forward. That horse couldn't even trot straight. He trotted kind of turkey tracking with his hindquarters out to the side and lame on one hind. Okay? I took a Navajo blanket, I folded it up with the bulk of it put up here in layers as we go forward, lifted the saddle, took her 135 pounds off the horse, put my 215 pounds on the horse, collected the horse a tiny bit, and we proceeded to trot straight, no lameness in the rear, and the horse went beautifully. She was letting him trot with no collection whatsoever, completely strung out, carrying all this weight right here, causing dorsiflexion, and the horse was a basket case. Wouldn't even vet into a ride that way. So that's how much difference can take place with nothing more than the change of the balance of the saddle, so we didn't carry all of our weight up front and a little bit of collection on the horse. It can make a world of difference, and immediate difference. And this horse was actually relieved, I would say, compared to being ridden the other way. So that's a little bit of what can happen, and you can also have, you do in most horses have fusing back here, which is natural, but you can have it through here, which is not natural, from the same thing happening, okay? From this croup operating like this and allowing these spinal processes to interfere with each other, and the back sagging, and us having a horse that's traveling with his muscles contracted and not in a weight-bearing frame. For him to carry weight, he has to contract his abdominals a little. He has muscles underneath the spine, such as the longus colli in front, that help collect the horse some. He has muscles in here that help him get his head down and bend at the pole. And obviously he has muscles underneath the loin area that pull his hindquarters under him. The muscles that make the horse reach forward with his legs are what help him tuck under. So it's nothing that you don't see in any form of basically good horsemanship that's needed here for weight carrying. Think about saddle positioning. And number one thing is, when you ride a horse bareback, people ask me, well, why would you move your saddle way back here? I'd be in the middle of my horse's back, and if I want to ride where I would ride naturally when I ride bareback. Well, if you ride bareback and sit up here, you're going to have some real problems, especially if you're a man, okay? Now, a little side note, and that is almost everybody from time immemorial, including the Greeks and the Romans and the Indians and the Huns, okay, and the early cowboys, rode gaited horses. That helped a little at the trot for riding bareback. Essentially, in the natural seat, the thing that the rider is trying to do is to support himself somewhat on the horse by making good contact. Now, if we're hugging this horse with our heels all the time, he isn't going to obey to any aids that we do give him when we give him a heel. So our contact in a natural seat is basically from the knee up. And we have our leg forward some, and we have the flat of the thigh against the horse. The flat of your muscle through here, say with your toe pointed in some, is now a large contact area all the way down against the horse. And the first thing that happens to this is that when we get into the saddle, if we turn our feet out like this, what happens to the flat of that muscle? Now all you've got is the rounded part of the back of your thigh that's in contact with the horse, okay? So I'm not going to be one that tells you heels down, heels down, heels down, but think about it. If you ride with your toes straight, and it takes some conscious effort to train yourself to do that, you put the flat of this muscle against the thigh. And the riders that rode bareback from time eons, you know, from the beginning of our association with the horse on into saddling, and then riders that were high school riders after that, clear up into the 19th and 20th century, would prefer to have the flat of their leg against the horse, and you can't turn like that and do it. You stay like this. The other thing that happens is now we have contact with this knee against the shoulder and the serratus muscles that we were looking at earlier on the horse. And so that helps us to keep from going forward so easily. And we've kept our very delicate areas away from the withers of the horse because we've simply put our legs forward to keep ourselves back somewhat. At that point, your leg will drop down some and you'll find your heel, if you're leaning back just a little and not leaning forward, but leaning back a little, your heel will come close to lining up in a line with your shoulder. But that's the back of your heel. Okay? So this is the natural seat position. And some dressage riders can tilt their pelvis and maintain that position and get their heel under them extremely well, but it's not an absolute necessity for you to do that. If you'll notice, Western riders, many Western riders are loose, extremely good in the saddle. They have their saddle back, particularly the older style rider that I see in the pictures of the old riders in the West. Their saddles set well back. None of them had them up on top of the horse's shoulder. And this is a necessity for carrying weight.
Here are the points that were covered in Part 1 of the Mechanics of Saddling. In Part 1, Lynn Brown discussed the history of saddling, mechanics of the horse, rider's impact on horse equilibrium, where to position the saddle, and the natural seat. In Part 2, Lynn covers saddle construction, tree and saddle fit, rider balance, rigging angle and position, weight-bearing area and pounds per square inch, the role of padding. He demonstrates how to palpate the horse's back for soreness, how to assess the fit of your saddle, and how to perform deep muscle massage. For further information about saddle fit or the patented Orthoflex saddle, call or write Brown's Performance Saddles, area code 417-667-7834. Thank you for watching Part 1. We know you'll enjoy Part 2 of the Mechanics of Saddling video series.